Welcome back to I Want to Teach English. I'm Jose Torres. This is where we explore the ideas and practices shaping how we support English learners. So, in today's conversation, it's going to center on equity, access, and what it really means to teach language alongside content. This is something that I think all of us that are in the trenches in the K 12 or even in the adult ed can relate to. And today's conversation, it centers on equity, access, and what it really means to teach language alongside content. So our guest has spent years helping educators rethink how they serve multilingual learners, pushing us towards more inclusive, asset-based, and rigorous instruction. So tonight I'm very, very excited to dig into this conversation and connect it to the work that we're doing every day with students. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Katie Toppel. Dr. Toppel, I have been after you for a while. I have been trying to get you on this show for a minute. So I'm very happy and I'm very glad that you took time off of your busy schedule to sit and talk with us about, language learning and all that good stuff. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
It's really something that, ever since I had that conversation with Dr. Carol Salva, her and I talked off camera and your name came up. And she's like, you got to get Katie on. You got to get Katie on. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, it's all about timing, right?
Yes.
I'm glad that you're on. So what do you say we just jump right in, Dr. Toppel, and we just kick it back and see where it goes? So the first thing I want to ask you is that you've often emphasized that all teachers are language teachers. And I can attest to this being in the K-12 system as long as I've been. So how could educators, especially those that are outside the ESL arena, if you will, how do they begin to authentically integrate language development into their daily instruction without feeling overwhelmed? Because that's a big factor in I can't imagine when it wasn't. Teachers always get overwhelmed. Can you address that?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing I think about is the fact that language is the medium through which we are teaching everything. No matter what content area you're using language, and there is a certain kind of language that you're going to be using in order to teach that content area, whether it's vocabulary or certain language functions that you're going to tend to use or certain verb tenses, whatever it might be. And we want to make sure that when content teachers are asking students to complete a project or write a paper or do a report or an oral presentation, that they're using the language of that content area effectively. And I think when we're able to step back and think about what the finished product is going to look like and what language it will include, it becomes clear what we need to support students to be able to utilize when they are communicating, talking, working with partners, and writing about the content that they're learning. And it does kind of take that process of breaking it down. There are some new tools that I've created just for my own teaching to be able to say, what is the language at play here? And I'm teaching kinder, first and second grade, which is obviously very different than, secondary math or secondary history, science, whatever. But the bottom line is we're really analyzing what is the essential language? What are the vocabulary words that that as teachers, we're going to be using throughout our daily lessons, and that we want to hear students using as they're talking and negotiating their understanding of content. What are the sentences going to sound like? What is that target language? And then making sure that we're able to explicitly support students to understand how to use it and to practice it. And I feel like at first it seems overwhelming. And once you really realize that content and language go hand in hand, it becomes more natural to include that language instruction and language support so that students can be producing it when they're reading and writing or speaking and writing about the content.
Absolutely. And this is something I've noticed a trend especially in the K-12 where there's a real push to have cross content emphasis, right? So like you can have, because I work with social studies, science, and of course language arts. And so there's always this push about having some of the vocabulary words that we're using in the science, subject, and have that crossover into the language arts. Now, it doesn't always match up and it doesn't always work, but I think there's a real push to have that, because as you were saying, what you were talking about, I was just thinking about what you were just saying. I think it really does take a team to make something like that work, because it's the math teacher is going to be like, I can't stop and do
Mhm.
language.
Mhm.
But if the whole team is involved in it, then I think that would alleviate a lot of the pressure. I mean, what do
That's
you think
one
of
of
that?
the reasons why I am such an advocate of co-teaching, because you're absolutely right that there is a unique expertise of a language specialist and what they bring, but the content teacher has their own expertise, and when we can team together, we really are able to support one another in supporting students to learn content and language together. I think um, there's never enough time, but when a language specialist can collaborate with a content teacher and model
Mhm.
what incorporating language looks like and model what teaching it looks like for those students, it can be really helpful. We call that job embedded professional learning. It's a
Yeah,
great way for content teachers to over time really embrace what it looks like to incorporate language. And it's part of content instruction is students being able to share about what they're learning about, whether it's when they're adults at home ask them at the dinner table, tell me what you're learning about,
yeah,
or if they're needing to articulate it for other purposes and presenting and whatnot, and they need to be able to clearly articulate what they're learning about. And that's
yeah.
that's part of language, is being able to organize your thoughts and make sure that your audience has a clear understanding of what it is that you're talking about. So they do really go hand in hand, but I very much agree that teaming together makes that language piece a little bit more palatable and just reasonable, that a content teacher can see it in action before kind of really getting the hang of it and being able to weave it in seamlessly on their own.
Sure. An ESL teacher is definitely good in that respect. Could actually be kind of a liaison, if you will, between these different content areas. But there are other people on the team that could do that. You have
Mhm.
intervention teachers, you have even resource teachers to some degree. So it's definitely doable. I think, the big brains really have to sit down and kind of work out the logistics of it. But I think if that team mentality can be played into, especially like the K-12 system, because
Mhm.
there is a lot, we are in the microscope a lot these days because of test scores and that sort of thing. and
Mhm.
and let's not kid ourselves. There's an issue there that can be addressed with something like this.
Yeah. The other thing I have to add is that for multilingual learners, that language piece is absolutely necessary, but all of the kids in the classroom are benefiting from an explicit focus on language. And I see this
Absolutely.
hugely in the kind of early elementary classrooms that I'm in, that um, co-teaching and infusing language really benefits all students. And there are many students who are also in need of that explicit focus on articulating themselves and building
Yep.
vocabulary and being able to talk about what we're learning about. So it's essential for multilingual learners who are learning the language, but it's absolutely so beneficial for all students, all kids, in classrooms, I think.
Yeah, and this would be a great way to avoid that overwhelming label that we were talking about. Try to avoid that overwhelming is because now you're sharing the responsibility with other people on a team, right? So anyway, that's great. All right, so let's talk. You talk a lot about. I'm going to skip down here for a second. Okay, you've spoken a lot about the importance of maintaining rigor for English learners, and this is something that I'm really a big proponent of as well. And what does like rigor with support? What does that really look like in practice, right? Especially for like newcomers or students at beginning proficiency level, because you could have students at low proficiency levels, and we know this, that have been in the system a long time, especially in the K-12 system. What does that look like for you?
I think, first of all, it's just the asset mindset of recognizing that students who are new to English are not new to learning and thinking, and that they bring with them a lot of knowledge. They may just not yet be capable of understanding the instruction fully in English and sharing back what they've learned in English, which is their new language. So that really asset-oriented mindset that these are capable learners is really essential. And I think we've come a long way in the field of educators valuing multilingual learners, but historically, maybe not so much. You know, there's always kind of wayward comments around, well, they don't have background knowledge. Maybe it's true that they don't have experience or background knowledge to this particular topic, but there's a wealth of background knowledge in their lived experiences and what they do know. And I think it's, when we think about sheltered instruction, it's really clearing up the misnomer that we are sheltering students from experiencing something challenging, or we are kind of watering down the content that we're presenting to them because it's too hard or they can't handle it. It's really providing, and this is where I'm going to go feature PSYOP, it's providing comprehensible input to support them to access grade level content, right? And we do that by making sure that we are scaffolding instruction, but also working with those scaffolds to make sure that we're teaching students how to use what they truly need and how we can then pull back on scaffolds to make sure that students are increasingly gaining more and more independence in the work that they're doing. So starting with that asset mindset, knowing that they're capable, but making sure that we are supporting access to grade level content, and that we're not saying, okay, well, we have a newcomer who's in 6th grade and what they really need is 3rd grade level reading because they're not there yet. And I've heard that expressed is, oh, this newcomer's in 4th grade. I just wish she could go to kindergarten because that's really what she needs right now. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Maybe this 4th grader does need phonics instruction, but they're in 4th grade and they absolutely don't need to be sitting with 5-year-olds to learn that. We need to make sure that we can find ways to teach them the skills that they need, but in age appropriate ways that make them feel as though, you know, they are part of their peer group and they are able to access the same content that their peers are learning about.
Sure, having materials that's appropriate for the age is kind of where I've been at, as you know, working with adult learners, because I spend a lot of time with K-12, but adult learners, they're not going to the same things that are relevant for a teenager, let's say, or someone a tweener. That's not gonna transfer to an adult who's just worked a 10-hour shift and he's coming in and he's so there has to be age appropriate material. You're right, spot on. And I think really when you take a step back and you're looking at, let's go back to that original question that kind of kicked things off about the teachers, the content teachers that are being overwhelmed because they have the newcomers or they have the English learners in their classrooms. And so like they're kind of racking their brain trying to figure this thing out. You take a step back because these kids, they know stuff, like you said, and it's just a matter of scaffolding. It's just a matter of providing some of the training wheels, if you will, for them to kind of put the pieces together and know they might not be at the same rate as everyone else in the classroom, but they are moving at the pace that they can because they are relying on their knowledge, the asset that they have already.
Yeah.
Excellent. That's great. All right. So let's look over here a little bit because a lot of the literacy research that's been historically centered on monolingual students, right? And this is something I've talked to at length. I can't tell you how many presentations I've given where I've talked about this very thing because we rely a lot on this research, and the research is based on monolingual learners, right? So what shifts do you think are most urgent right now to make literacy instruction more inclusive and responsive to multilingual learners? And I want to kind of emphasize the word inclusive because I think people have different ideas about what that really means. So maybe you could speak to that.
I think it's essential to recognize that our multilingual learners need everything that we know is part of good literacy instruction, what research tells us we need to be doing, and they need more. That when, if we're looking at kind of our different ropes of literacy instruction, that of course we're teaching them the skills they need to be able to recognize the word on the page. But then we have more ropes that are in those areas of language comprehension. And we need to be simultaneously making sure that students are having that language comprehension, even when they're learning discrete skills. So whether it's phonemic awareness or whether it's phonics, that we're not just doing decontextualized skills. And those skills are absolutely necessary and important, but weaving in to make sure that they are understanding, like even at the CVC word level, a lot of CVC words are words that are new to students who are learning English. And so we
Yep.
need to make sure that rather than just learning letters and sounds and blending so that they can read the word, if that word doesn't have meaning, we're a little bit lost in the shuffle of what is then the purpose of reading, right? And I think a lot of kids are not reading. They're not reading for pleasure at
They're
this
not.
time in our technology driven world. And
Yes.
so when from a young age they learn, like, I can sound that out and it doesn't have any meaning to me, what makes them want to read and want to pick up a book? It's meaning, it's what those words mean. And so just even having, strategies to make sure that when we're teaching those discrete skills, we're pairing it with what do those words mean, but in strategic ways, because we don't want, there's kind of talk about if we're using pictures and then students are just going to look at the picture and then they're going to recognize the word and they're not decoding. And so the teachers that I work with, we've really been strategic about how we use pictures, because we don't want students guessing. So we want them using their knowledge of letters and sounds to decode words.
Yep.
But then if they're learning English, we also want them to have that visual point of that this is a picture of what that word means. And it's quick, but it gives them kind of more opportunities to develop vocabulary, because the vocabulary that students who are learning English need is not just our tier 2 and tier 3 words, but a lot of tier 1 words that might be common and might be in other students' oral language repertoire, but there's still words that students learning English need to learn. And sometimes there are even words that students who know English need to learn because they're phonetically contrived in our literacy instruction, and they might not yet be familiar, like the word cot or the word kit or the word wed. Those are not necessarily familiar. So we need to make sure that we can give that context so that reading always carries meaning, because that's going to be, I think, the driving force in what makes kids say, ooh, that was a story. That actually meant something, and I want to know more. I want to follow that character. I want to hear more or do more on my own. Because I worry that's not something that is widespread anymore, that kids read for pleasure. I think it's going away. And
and something,
not a good thing.
No, but you touch on some very important things about having these words that have meaning attached to it, right? Because there's a lot of research that shows that phonological awareness is one of the strongest predictors of reading ability, right? And overall literacy, honestly. So, and really that kind of goes back to the exposure of the language. And I'll give you a really something that's happening right now. Like I have students who have been, I like to call it the bubble, right? Where they only interact socially with other Spanish speaking students, right? So they go throughout their day. They don't actually interact with any of the English speaking students. They only interact with themselves. And so there's also, I think there's this enabling element. The teachers, they might have their heart in the right place, but they're not thinking about the long-term consequence of this, in that they're enabling students to not having to really need to do it, to learn and speak English. And so they're going through, now I have like third graders that have been here since pre-K, and they're still struggling just to understand what you're saying. And it's like, that shouldn't be like that. It really shouldn't.
Right.
So like I talk to the parents, the parents are like, well, we just talk to them in Spanish at home. I'm like, well, I mean, I'm not telling you how to run your household, but I mean, the students aren't really getting all the exposure that they need in order to kind of bring all this in. Now, this is a little bit different, Dr. Toppel, because with adult learners, it's very different than with children. We know that children learn language a lot differently. You can have children learn simultaneously different languages, right? An adult will come in, right? And so they have to attach meaning to those words, as you were alluding to earlier. And that's how they're able to build on their phonological word. That's how they're able to build their vocabulary, because they're attaching it to what they already know. They just kind of fuse the Spanish word and the English word, and they're attached, and
Mhm.
it just kind of repetition. You got to drill, and then they just kind of get it. Whereas students just are in the element of it, I guess. There's something at the neurological level. It's a little bit of, I'm trying to understand it myself, but I think that there's, if you dig enough into enough research, I mean, there's a lot there that kind of points to that, where uh, we just know that children learn differently than adults, but it all comes down to the meaning of the word, as you say, and how they're able to attach the meaning. I think is the key.
And the relevance for adult learners, that immediate relevance of how are they going to, how does what they're learning connect to their lived experience and their
Hmm.
need to use the language.
Yep.
So, if they're needing to use English to negotiate interactions in their workplace, the instruction has to somehow connect to that so that they can see the relevance and know that, and so that they can practice. I think the
Yeah.
practice piece is huge. And I know when I learned Spanish in middle and high school, we learned it by doing grammar drills and filling in
Hmm.
worksheets, but I don't remember having conversations in the class and actually using Spanish. And I remember in college having a quiz or a final or something, and it was, you went up to the teacher and he gave you a scenario. And I remember specifically, he said, "You are sick and you need to call the doctor's office. Go." And so I had to then think, okay, so what am I gonna, he was pretending to be the receptionist, and that was the test that
Yeah.
I was able to show that. And so it's building community so that learners feel comfortable. I think, I know in with little kids, they want to be the volunteer. They
Yeah.
are just desperate to be selected and chosen. Are we all going to have a turn? But as you get older, the reticence increases, that teens think everything's, lame. I don't know if that's even a word we use anymore. Like
I,
they're hesitant. They don't, that's not cool. I don't want to do
I'm
that.
sure they say different things by now. Go on.
Yes, I'm sure they do. And so it's that building community and really making it a safe space, because we need to have them practicing the
Yeah.
target language and practicing what they know about the content. It can't all just be receptive. You have to be willing to put yourself out there, knowing that as you get older, that's going to come into play. You have to
Yeah.
talk to people and interact, and you have to ask questions, and you'll go through job interviews, and all of those, all of that practice just builds more comfort with interacting and talking and trying, and knowing that when we make mistakes, it's okay.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to fault you for making a mistake, because that's how you learn. I know, I mean, I tend to be a little bit of a perfectionist, but if I get something wrong, I'm going to remember that
Yeah.
more
Oh
than
yeah.
probably I remember
Oh
the right
yes.
answer
It's
that I
kind of
got.
sticks right
Just
in there.
because, yeah, so we have to be willing to make mistakes, and know that
Absolutely.
that's absolutely part of the process, and just be willing to put ourselves out there and practice,
Yeah.
practice, practice, practice what it is that we're working on.
That's how you remember things, with the impact. That's why we're like, hey, do you remember when Michael Jackson died? I'm like, you know exactly where you were,
I
you know
do.
exactly the moment, the time of day. So it's like, there's, when it impacts you like that. I'll give you an
Yeah.
example. Like, tomorrow I'm having my night class, and I invited somebody to come and pretend to be like the interviewer. She's like, we're doing like this mock interview, and so I'm gearing up my adult students to get ready to, like, if you want to look for a new job. And so it's
Mhm.
a kind of an uncomfortable situation, and it's uncomfortable on purpose, because nobody goes into an interview, like, hey, what's going on? They're always nervous. You're always gonna have
Mhm.
butterflies. It doesn't matter what it is. And so I
Yeah.
said, look, you guys already know you got to prep for this. And so I'm
Mhm.
kind of guiding them through the whole thing, and they're nervous as all heck, and
Mhm.
as well they should be. And I said, because this is what's going to impact you when you're sitting there in front of, across the desk from this person, this woman, and she's going to be asking these questions. At least I'm giving you the questions beforehand, but it's all about impact. So, like in my work, right, I work with adult learners in the evenings, and I've seen how foundational skills like phonics, and this is what the drum I've been beating forever, how that can unlock both
Mhm.
reading and writing, because there's really been a lot of emphasis. I don't know if you've noticed, there's been a real push and emphasis on writing as of late, at least the last few years. And so this is one of the things that I'm pushing as well. And so I'm kind of you know, looking at how phonics really plays into that, and it goes back to like Barbara Birch's 2007, literacy model and whatnot. But like, how do you view the role of this explicit instruction? Like phonics, for example, because people are like, "Oh, phonics is boring." I said, "Well, you don't like teach it like with little kids and foundations. Sit there and do drills with it. You incorporate it in some of the words. Like for example, like the difference between butt and boot. They'll want to say boot, right? They won't say butt. They'll say, well, there's a big difference because boot is what you put on your feet, you know? So, and butt is like when you want to like have two contrasting ideas in a sentence. And that plays into uh, the whole aspect of writing and the whole sentence structure. And just, it adds so much context, right? So like within a broader meaning centered approach to language development, like how do you see this contextualization of phonics and the role of explicit instruction?
I mean, absolutely necessary. I've been in a school district where we have been doing explicit phonics instruction for as long as I can remember. But it's important to know that it is it's a very important piece, but it is one piece of a puzzle that gets increasingly more complex, and that it unlocks a lot for students, but that we need to make sure that we say swirling, incorporating all of the different language domains. I always like to make sure that I write text for students to read that connects to what we're learning about, because they know their sounds, and then often the texts they read are a little wonky, especially for very emerging readers, and there's no point to the text that they're reading.
Yeah.
And that's again where that meaning is. If you have a newcomer who's learning a language and the words in the text are kind of, if a story lacks meaning, it's really hard to have the motivation to read it and to kind of make sense of why are we reading this. And so I always like to put a little text together so that we're reading about what we're learning about. And that can be hard, because if you only know so many sounds and you're reading short CVC words, it can be hard to read about geography or more complex topics. But I do the best that I can, and I sometimes will enlist the help of AI to get at least a starter text, and then I work with it, because it's so motivating when students are reading about something, and helpful when they're bringing knowledge of what they're reading to help them make sense of what they're reading, rather than something that really is kind of disconnected and nonsensical based on what the phonics pattern is that they're learning. So absolutely necessary to do explicit phonics, to reinforce it with writing, and making sure that once we've taught certain phonics patterns, that we are reminding students of the rules involved and holding them accountable in their writing to produce the correct, as best they can, the correct spellings of those words based on what they've learned in phonics, because reading and writing really mutually reinforce themselves. And that's a great way for students to kind of have that recall of what they've learned in phonics. But it's, I think the pushback on that is the idea that somehow phonics is the only thing emphasized, and that it's done in isolation. And it's just like,
it's not true.
These drills. And that's not at all what the research on literacy instruction tells us. That absolutely we need to unlock that code, and then we need to make sure that students are getting it at the word level, at the sentence level, in a longer text, and then they're able to build their skills so that they are reading passages eventually that have meaning, and then we're thinking about those, we're talking about them. There's so much more, and it's so layered, but it is a piece and not the entire puzzle, nor I don't think has it ever been. But I think that's kind of a misconception. It's especially pushback from our field of working with multilingual learners, is there's too much emphasis on phonics, but they need to understand. Yes, they do. And I think we're more on the same page on that than sometimes is noticed. I'm not sure really how to say that, but in our field, there's worry that we're focusing too much on phonics and word reading, and it's at the detriment of other things. And research tells us it's all of the above.
Well, right, because teaching phonics is essentially teaching reading, and teaching reading is what leads to writing, right?
Mhm.
So, like, writing is like one of the most challenging domains for English learners. I think we could all agree to that. So, what are some high impact strategies though that you've seen that help students build confidence and fluency in writing itself? And I'll come back after you answer and I'll add my 2 cents.
First and foremost, oracy and being able to articulate what it is that you want to write or are going to write before you write it. Because if you can't say it, if you can't speak it,
Hmm.
you can't write it.
Yep,
And
exactly.
there's, with young learners who are learning how to write, and there's so much that goes into that. It's forming letters and knowing letter sounds and, just fine tuning, fine motor, all of that. There's so much work their brain is doing that they need to be really fluent at being able to say what they want to write
Hmm.
before they can put it down. And so, and even for, older learners, we need to first and foremost be able to organize, okay, this is what I want to say, and then kind of break it up and word by word or bit by bit get it onto the paper. But that means when we're learning new content, we're having multiple opportunities to engage in different ways to talk about it and practice it. And I like to use a lot of instructional charts that really help students build fluency with that oral language part before they try to write it. And so one example is simple can have our chart. So if we're learning about a topic, and like, let's say it's in kindergarten, we do a unit, we're learning about beavers, right? So beavers have, what are all the things that they have? We learned about how they have orange teeth, they have flat tails, they have brown fur. And so on your chart, you're listing those things, but it gives them the ability to put it in a complete sentence.
Yeah.
Beavers have, and then, they say their fact. And
Hmm.
then, beavers they're good swimmers. They are mammals, different things like that. And again, beavers is that starter, and then they can add in the detail that they learned and then what they can do. And so then just orally practicing all of those different facts and sentences when they go to write, they have those at the ready that they know. Beavers can swim, beavers have orange teeth, all those different pieces of information. Compared to, we just did a unit, we adopted a new knowledge building curriculum. We just did a unit in first grade on the American Revolution. So they're 6 years old, learning about the American Revolution. That content is so challenging that even with practice, a lot of my students learning English or at the beginning stages of English, they're not yet at a point when they can fluently talk about the American Revolution. So writing sentences about it is increasingly more difficult. So that oral language needs to come first, because like I said, if we can't say it, we can't write it. So we need to prioritize giving students opportunities to say it back, talk about it, negotiate
Yep.
it, and feel comfortable speaking it before they can write it.
And you had said something earlier, talking about the students having, being asset based, and really, I think L1 literacy is so vital to all of
Yes.
this that you're saying, because
Yes.
if they're having literacy issues in their L1, well, there's nothing to carry over into the L2. So we
True.
have a completely different problem here at this point.
Yes.
But is assuming that they have a well enough established L1 literacy wise, all of those things you say are very practical, and it can translate into it just takes an extra step or two, but it definitely transfers over. So the students can formulate the idea, they can formulate their responses. Sometimes they'll have to obviously formulate it in their L1, but then they'll be able to articulate it eventually and then write it out, and that's the process, honestly. But you got to have that L1 established, no question.
Yeah. It is, and I've seen that in newcomers who are very strong in their L1 literacy, how quickly they are able to really take off in English, because they're coming in with so many skills, and they do know how to read, they know how to write, and then they are just kind of transferring that. And so yes, they need the English words, but once they're getting a hold of those, they're just able to accomplish so much. And it's a different scenario and a different process to support students who may be coming in without that L1 literacy.
Right. Or it's, not very well grounded. And that creates a whole different set of problems. I have throughout your career, you always come across students like that, and it's very challenging. I mean, some of them can get over the hurdle. It just takes a lot of work,
Mhm.
But anyway, but that's a pretty good segue to highlighting the importance of asset based mindset, right? So, like, let me ask you. So, how can schools move beyond this surface level appreciation of multilingual learners, right? And truly leverage students' linguistic and cultural assets in instruction. Let's just break that down for a second, because when we're talking about their linguistic assets, right? We just kind of talked about that now, but now let's bring in culture into that conversation. Like, how do schools really how are they able to leverage that in terms of instruction?
I think it might sound pretty basic, but you have to know your learners. You have to know them in order to be able to leverage what they know and make connections to instruction. And so it's the very first step of knowing your learners as how they show up in school, and also knowing what are they doing and what's happening in their life when they're not in school, who's in their family, who lives in their home, what activities are they doing, what do they do with their family, what do they like to do on their own, do they play sports, what are their interests in terms of pop culture, music,
Yeah.
Are they reading, are they watching TV, are they using their iPad a lot, what are they accessing, and especially I have students who like, I don't like school, this is boring, I don't like this. What is it that they do like? Because I have to find out to leverage that and bring it in. And then it's that, one of our goals is to build background, and there's different elements of that. One of them is accessing what students know. And, there's different ways teachers can do that to make sure we know a lot about our students. And then there's the idea of building background and supporting them to kind of have a bridge to what we're going to learn about. But the other part of it is explicitly making connections so that they feel seen in the context of what we're learning about. So, if you know that a bunch of your students really enjoy soccer, how are you connecting what you're learning about to soccer?
That could be very combustible. But go ahead. Sorry.
And just yes, there's so many different students in many areas of but it's just making sure that we can leverage what we can, especially so they feel seen and they know they belong, and this is their community and they are an important part of it. And the other part is parent communication, which may be different at different kind of levels of learning. But for young students, being in contact with their parents and just communicating so their parents know also that they are a welcome and important part of the school community. Something I try to do, I have a lot of students who celebrated Ramadan and just celebrated Eid. And so I make it a point to reach out to them and wish them a happy Ramadan. And when it comes to Eid, wish them a happy Eid. And I get immediate responses from parents, so thankful of like, it makes them feel seen. And I don't celebrate it, but I've learned over time what it entails, and that, students may be fasting, and often not at elementary school, but that's something that we as teachers need to know, because it's part of how they are going to show up at school for an entire month. And I really wanted to avoid giving students ELPA, our language proficiency test, if they were going to be fasting or even at all during the month of Ramadan, because
or have like a cupcake party in the middle of it, right?
Yes, but it's having that like cultural awareness to know that students are experiencing different things, and that knowing it and appreciating it and connecting with families around it, no matter whether it's a holiday they're celebrating or something else going on. But just that element, we all know that when we feel seen, we have a different way of showing up in that community. And when you feel not seen, that is hugely detrimental to how you show up in the community if you don't feel recognized and cared for, and if you feel like your teacher doesn't really know you beyond just, who you are as a student. But when they know you had a soccer game and they say, how'd it go? And you say, oh, I scored a goal. And they say, that's awesome. Just that little interaction is that little bit of feeling seen. And then when it goes deeper into, the language and culture that make you who you are,
Yeah.
I think you feel all the more connected and seen by the educators who are in charge of your education.
Yeah, and you touched on a number of really valid points, and I'd like to add to it. And that I'll share a story from a few years back in school I was at. This is like when all of a sudden there was a major influx of immigrants into our community, right? And so we were all welcoming them, and we had the school, basically the dynamics of the school, the demographics of the school had changed drastically. And so I noticed that there were some things that were bubbling up socially with the kids, right? And then it all boiled over one day in the cafeteria, and there was this huge fight, right? And I remember, like, after school, after the school police came and broke it all up, and the principal called me to her office, and she sat me down. She's like, Mr. Torres, why were they fighting? I don't understand. They're all like the same. What were they fighting about? And this is like cultural nuances that I was talking about. So you got to break down who was fighting who, because you had Guatemalans on this side, and you had the Mexicans on this side, you had the Salvadorians on this side, and culturally these people just came here now. There's a lot of like cultural animosities between them, and so it just kind of, whatever carried over from where they were from came here, and so it just kind of boiled over. So it took time. But we had those conversations. They were not always easy conversations, but it took some time for us to kind of smooth that over. And now now things are running a little bit more smoothly. But initially, it's just like what you were saying before. Like, you got to know your students, and I don't think this principal really took the time to really kind of figure out what was going. They certainly didn't ask anybody. At least they didn't ask me anyway. But it's like there was all this stuff going on. I could have come in at some point and say, yeah, we got to talk about this, because if we don't intervene at some point, this is going to, but it's all in the past now, but we all learned a valuable lesson from that experience, because if you don't meet the challenges of the cultures of the students that you're teaching, especially that those are crucial days, when you talk about teenagers and preteens, there's a lot of hormone changes, and a lot of things are happening. Not so much maybe with the little ones, but definitely with the big ones. You have to kind of know what's going on.
And knowing that we're all different and we don't have the same lived experience. So we have to approach families and students with an open mindset to listen, to understand, rather than passing a judgment of, well, they didn't do this in the way that I expected them to. Because likely there's a reason, and if we can understand what their barriers were, or what they were going through, what their perspective was, then we can just have conversations where we can be open to understand, rather than expecting everyone to show up in our school system in the same way, because our systems don't, our systems play to certain people, and they don't work for everyone. So we need to understand where the roadblocks are, so that we can work to be more inclusive and be more, appropriate for everyone who walks through the doors of a school. I think something I hear is the one more thing comment. The attending to the needs of multilingual learners or students learning English is one more thing on an already very full plate. And I mean, I get that. No, there is no teacher out there who has extra time, or who feels like they're living a leisurely experience of being able to check off everything on their to-do list. But we really need to recognize that it's not one more thing. It has to be, woven into whatever we're doing the needs of multilingual learners have to be essential part of our thinking, as we plan lessons and as we just navigate any job that we're doing. I think when I first started in the role as a language specialist, my job was very isolated. And I think that it was kind of, students went to the language teacher, the language box was checked, and that was it. And we've really moved towards an understanding that, everyone shares that responsibility. And so it does have to be part of it. But like I said before, it is something, when we're focusing on language, it's not just benefiting kids who are learning English. It really is essential for everyone. I mean, I went to my daughter's volleyball tournament, and I noticed that there's this, I don't even know what to call it because I don't feel positively about it, but it's the siblings with the iPads. Every sibling who comes to the volleyball tournament has an iPad in their hand, and they're on their iPad. There are 17 volleyball matches going on. It's exciting. There's, and they're just on their iPad. Yeah. And you look around and everybody is looking at a screen, not the parents, but it's so pervasive. Mm-hmm. And so that attention to language and interaction and being in community with one another, it is so important to make sure that is really at the forefront of what we're doing, and that students are not passive, and that they're actively engaged in talking and thinking and writing about what they're learning about. Even if it is secondary content area, we need to talk and write about it. It has all of those language areas and domains of literacy are necessary parts of learning about any content area. So I'm just going to say one more thing. When it comes to PD, I've always been a proponent of make what you need it to be. Like, I don't ever feel like I'm fully given, in terms of my role as a language specialist, the professional learning I need to be the best language teacher I can. So I do it myself. And we, Dr. Carol Salva and I, along with Ton Nguyen, wrote a book, DIY PD, because we realized that if it's not given to you, you have to find a way to get it, because that students still need it, regardless of whether it's like an orchestrated, event provided to you in your role or not. The students still need it. So I'm a big fan of, this is what I want to learn about, so I'm going to learn about it. And that has made me the teacher I am, because I just, any book anybody writes about working with multilingual learners, I've bought it, I've read it, I've led a book study on it, because I want to know it all.
Yeah. And so on that note, Dr. Toppel, I'd like to ask you, looking ahead, like, what gives you hope in the field of multilingual education? What advice would you give the educators who are committed, like myself, and millions of other people out there who are committed to doing this work, but are navigating systems that aren't always designed with English learners in mind? And I could speak to that till the cows come home, but please enlighten us.
I mean, I think my hope for the field in general is that there's a wider recognition that multilingualism is, name the adjective, wonderful, powerful, amazing, brilliant. It's such an asset. And so many other countries have students learning multiple languages simultaneously, and we are not. And we need to be recognizing more that there is such a brilliance that multilingual learners bring. And I think just holding on to that and knowing that the students, if I think about the students on my caseload, they're kindergarten, first grade, second grade, they're such amazing people, and they are so smart, and they're so creative. And I can only say it's about them. And I think that's what teachers bring to the profession, is that our heart is in it for the students that we are working with. But part of the role then is that advocacy of knowing that we have to speak up, and if it's not right and it's not equitable or it's not okay, we have to be that voice.
If you can get a word in there, get a word in and advocate for these kids, because somebody has to, because they can't. It's an uphill battle either way you look at it.
And teaching them that their voice matters, so that they build that capacity to be able to. I will say I have a student who is young and actively participates in his own IEP meeting. He is sitting right there, and he is a voice at the table. And that, to me, that is just the best. He knows his voice matters, and he's able to articulate what he needs, what he doesn't need, what's going on for him. And that's the goal, that it's not just us advocating for our students, but really empowering them to know that their voice matters and that they can also have a seat at the table and stand up for what they know is right for them.
Dr. Katie Toppel, everyone. I gotta say, this turned out really well. I mean, we hit some really good points. I'm just listening and absorbing as much as I can, but I think we're on the same wavelength, honestly. A lot of things you were saying, it was just like I was right in sync with what you were saying. I mean, this is a tough job, man.
Yeah, it is.
But that's why the toughest of us have to do it. Dr. Toppel, how can people find you?
I am at this point, I mean, on LinkedIn and on Instagram at Dr. Toppel. No longer on Twitter, but I do post about teaching mostly on Instagram. Okay,
no website, no drkatietoppel.com or
anything? No, that is on my list of goals for 2026 is to start a website.
Don't worry, I won't get the domain and then sell it to you. Don't worry. You better register.
Not yet, but stay tuned.
Any books coming out this year?
Yeah, we actually do have 2 new SIOP books that are coming out. We have our general SIOP book geared towards K-12 teachers. And then we also have editions, the new ones coming out, a secondary edition and an elementary edition. So that way teachers can make sure that all of the example scenarios, things like that, are geared towards the age group that they are teaching. So those should be out later this year.
So if you can send me the link, I will put the links to those books in the description. Please support Dr. Katie Toppel. Check her out. Her stuff is fantastic.